Adams State College. Great stories begin here.
It is my great pleasure to introduce the next two presenters. Laurel Heimstra and Loraine Glidewell are students in a rarely offered course called Major Authors. We're focusing on Toni Morrison in that 400 level course. We're reading almost all of Morrison's novels this term. After we read the very first novel that Morrison ever wrote, The Bluest Eye, they both submitted papers that were quite wonderful, and they have been building on them a bit since then. There's a great deal of intertextuality that they're incorporating a little bit, but this is going to mostly focus on the first novel that she wrote, The Bluest Eye. They have been looking at some of the ways that Morrison creates circumstances in her novels of tremendous social pressure to almost experiment on what the outcomes are going to be on characters. But of course the pressure cooker of the society that she is looking at is being African American, either during the slave era, shortly after, or during the civil rights movement, or even right now. So lots of intersections of race, class, and gender in this work. One thing both of these two critics are interested in considering is the idea that the character Paul D presents to Sethe at the end of Beloved. She's gone mad after murdering her own child to prevent it from being returned to slavery. But he says to her, Sethe, you are your own best thing. So Laurel's going to present first. I'm going to introduce her in a minute, but they first have just 5 slides that give you a little more context about Morrison. Then I'll introduce Laurel and then Loraine. So,
got any Morrison fans in the house? Oh, awesome. So this is Toni Morrison. She's a Nobel laureate and Pulitzer Prize winner. Right there, which I didn't touch the screen. So she was born in Loraine, Ohio. I had to put that because my name is Loraine. Thought it was somewhat relevant. She is praised for her magic realism and realism approaches in African American literature. And a great quote was that she writes village literature, fiction that is really for the village, for the tribe. So, Morrison is not the product of a broken home. I thought this was relevant because all of her novels are quite tragic and painful to read. So you would think that she would have lived a hard life, but really she came from a wonderful family. Her father told her a lot of stories before bed, and these were incorporated into her literature and are part of what made her so successful today. A little bit about her education background. She got her bachelor's in English from Howard University, a master's in English from Cornell University. She taught, she got married, she got divorced, she has children, and she's been very successful and has a dominant career as a woman in today's literature.
Just to give you a little bit of perspective on what Morrison thinks of her own writing, we have a quote from her, and she gave this in a radio interview. I write without gender focus. It happens that what provokes my imagination as a writer has to do with the culture of Black people. I regard the whole world as my canvas, and I write out of that sensibility of what I find provocative and the sensibility of being a woman, but I don't write women's literature as such. I think it would confine me. I am valuable as a writer because I am a woman, because women, it seems to me, have some special knowledge about certain things. It comes from the ways in which they view the world and from women's imagination. Once it is unruly and let loose, it can bring things to the surface that men, trained to be men in a certain way, have difficulty in getting access to. The last that we have is a novel list, and as you can see, her first one came out in 1970, her most recent one in 2008, and she has as Dr. Guerrero Murphy said, an intertextuality that weaves all of them together.
Thank you.
Okay, so Laurel Heimstra is going to present her paper. She's a rising junior. She wanted you to know that she's the happily married mother of 5. She is an education major, not an English major, but she has a social studies and English emphases. She works in the writing studio as an excellent tutor there. She's only lived in the San Luis Valley for 2 years, moved from Wisconsin and grew up in the Dakotas. So,
Yes.
Laurel.
Thank you. Okay. This discussion is mostly based on The Bluest Eye and Song of Solomon. The Bluest Eye is the story of class within the African American community, which condemns a young girl for the bad actions of her parents and leaves her to make her own way. She finds that way by retreating into a world of make-believe and insanity where she has beautiful blue eyes. This is a commentary on the structure of the African American community that prevents it from reaching out to and helping its own. The Bluest Eye is a powerful, wonderfully written book. I found it hard to read in spite of its power and the expressive and beautiful language. The reason for this difficulty was the subject matter of the story. It was such a strong contrast to the writing that it was even more painful than a similar story with less skill in the presentation. The very beauty of the writings and oftentimes images made the harshness and ugliness of the plot and storyline even harsher and uglier. This was also a large part of the power in the writing, as the contrast made me sit up and take notice, as well as continuing to read in spite of a strong desire to stop the pain. This left me feeling very much like the children in the story, who also have to continue, even though they often want to give up and walk away from the pain and beauty that make up their lives. Similar contrasts can be found throughout the book. It is expressed in the contrast between the innocence of childhood and the adult ugliness and pain that erode that innocence. It is also expressed in the contrast between the different living situations. For example, the house where Pekala's mother works and the building where Pekala lives and grows up. The care Pekala's mother provides for her white charges and the lack of care she provides for her own family, as well as the distance of the adult voice narrator from her past and her childhood impressions. By contrasting these many things and doing it very skillfully, Toni Morrison draws the audience in and holds them captive to the end, allowing her points to be made and giving her readers the ability to see the reality of the world, of the vulnerable and helpless, in strong contrast to the powerful and predatory. Song of Solomon is a coming-of-age story for Milkman, who is expected to follow in his father's footsteps. He discovers his family ancestors and in the process discovers himself. In part, this is also a commentary on the difference between men and women and how they handle the challenges of life and how they can achieve balance and happiness. Song of Solomon is a study of contrasts. Morrison contrasts beauty of all kinds to the less than beautiful aspects of reality. She contrasts the mystical with the earthly. She contrasts men and women and their places in society, both real and imagined. She contrasts maturity with stunted growth. The stunted growth can be attributed to many things. However, the strongest end result of them all is hate in one form or another. She also contrasts material desire and greed to the growth of human beings when they discover their real identities and the value of family and heritage. These very contrasts and opposites create balance in the novel and eventually in the character of Milkman. She does all of this by using myth intended to be androcentric and converting it to a more modern version that incorporates the female half of humanity, while also incorporating family, nature, and music to tie it all together. Morrison's view of her work is also contrasting and contradictory. I'll refer you back to the quote I read earlier, where she talks about being a woman writer, but not writing women's literature as such. This statement is contradictory. She's discussing what she is not, a writer of women's literature and what she is, a writer who writes from the perspective and imagination of being a woman. These are the kinds of contrasts that populate her works and express the reality of our world. The world and her works are full of binary opposites and contradictions that somehow work to make a whole picture. When these opposites are missing from life, so is balance. And leaving these binary opposites out of her novels would leave the reader and the story feeling incomplete. As stated before, Song of Solomon is based on androcentric myth, which has been altered to include the female view and influence. Morrison uses flight to represent the male half of the population and song to represent the female half. In the end, she shows both milkman and pilot as two characters who are balanced because they can both sing and fly, combining contrasts to form that balance. In Milkman's acknowledgement of Pilot's abilities to both sing and fly, and by accepting her request that he sing at her death, Milkman has now become a balanced individual who has his own identity that does not require him to be only one thing. He has managed this because he has learned who his ancestors are and where he came from, as well as because of the guidance and love from Pilot. We see a balance of a male and female to make a whole person, thereby refuting the traditional myths that are androcentric in nature while using them to build upon. Morrison achieves many of her objectives by using prose-like language to detail horrific events and images. One of my favorite prose-like passages comes from The Bluest Eye. Quote, they come from Mobile, Aiken, from Newport News, from Marietta, from Meriden, and the sound of these places in their mouths make you think of love. When you ask them where they are from, they tilt their heads and say Mobile, and you think you've been kissed. They say Aiken, and you see a white butterfly glance off a fence with a torn wing. They say Natchitoches, and you want to say, yes, I will. You don't know what these towns are like, but you love what happens in the air when they open their lips and let the names ease out. This passage is like poetry, and yet as I went deeper into what starts as beauty, it doesn't take very long to come to the contrast, the ugly. Dr. Morrison lets us see what is inside that beauty. It is revealed when Junior, a young boy with a mother from one of these beautiful sounding places, invites Pekala into the house to see newborn kittens and ends with him throwing the cat, the only thing his mother truly loves, into Pekala's face. Pekala gets blamed for this incident because she does not fit into the accepted idea of beauty and good breeding. The irony of this is that Pekala, who is seen as ugly and of lower class, is the one who understands the immorality of what has happened and still sees only the beauty of the woman, the appearances of the house and the life, and the surface of everything. At the same time, Pekala lives the opposite and understands it too. Again, the contrasts and contradictions are what makes Pekala human and real, while the artifice of the ideal makes reality that much harder to deal with. The Bluest Eye expresses contrast between the world of the white privileged class and the African American underprivileged class. By depicting the situation through the eyes of a child who is now an adult, the reader sees how an entire race was treated as children often are, and how degrading and defeating that attitude was and still is. By expressing these ideas with beauty and power, it gives them more power and healing potential. By exposing what was wrong, it gives people the power to make it right. In Song of Solomon, Morrison uses the traditional myths, music, and flight to teach us to look to our past and present, contrasts in themselves, to become whole communities, societies, cultures, races, and individuals within those structures. She tells the reader that they are not confined by tradition or their upbringing if they choose not to be. They can become what they were intended to be, balanced within contradictions and contrasts.
Thank you very much, Laura. All right, so we're going to hear now from Loraine Glidewell. She is a double major in organismal biology and English with a minor in chemistry. dream job would be to be a wildlife biologist who gets to travel and write exciting tales about the animals and other objects she sees. She works on campus as a tutor in English and biology and works on microbiology lab prep. She is one of the MSOs for the FIG groups. Off campus, she works on the alligator farm and has a great passion for alligators. Her hobbies are dancing, fishing, and she said to tell you one interesting fact is that she once got a fish hook in her eyeball. I wouldn't know that. She seems extremely perceptive to me. Loraine.
Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Murphy. So, my central focus is the map is not the territory. It's a phrase that has been persistent throughout our history, and I wanted to incorporate it into my paper. Is anyone familiar with the map is not the territory and what that means? Perfect. I have a purpose in speaking today. So, how I devised this was I broke it up into 3 portions. The first is context, to provide a little background on the phrase. The second is development, just to develop it a little more. And then the third is a personal response, which is how this paper originally started. And I decided it was the most powerful way to give an example of the map is not the territory and maybe inspire a few of you. So, what's going to be addressed in the first portion is where did the map is not the territory originate and how has it been used? It originated actually with a Polish-American scientist and philosopher named Alfred Korzybski, and he utilized this phrase to both describe an idea and solve a problem. The idea was that an abstraction derived from something or a reaction to it is not the thing itself. And the problem was that he believed a lot of people confused maps with territories or models of reality with reality itself. This phrase resurfaced in 1931 in a paper given at the meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And it said that the map may have similar or dissimilar constructs than the territory, but the map is not the territory. So this also served as the major premise for general semantics and neuralistic programming. General semantics is the study focused around the idea that language enslaves us by conditioning our brains to perceive a false reality. And the goal was to separate, or I guess the best way to put it is be conscious of abstracting. And neurolinguistic programming is the controversial psychotherapy used to change patterns of behavior. Both of those processes drew from the map is not the territory. This phrase is also seen in everyday life. It can be depicted as judging a book by its cover, racial and gender discrimination and stereotyping, and assessment and comprehension of a task, person, place, or thing. And how I use this, particularly in my personal response, is how people are mapped and how that is different from their personal territory. The next part that I would like to discuss is development. So the map is not the territory. I may seem like an English major since I am presenting in an English format, and I am, but I am also a science major. So I couldn't help it but incorporate that a little bit into the development of this phrase. So what's going to be addressed here is how can the gap be bridged between science and Toni Morrison to create a new territory? And how does the gap between cause and effect interplay to change an already existing territory? So is anyone familiar with August Crow? Tyler, you should be. Okay, so August Crow is the father of comparative anatomy, and he actually won the Nobel laureate in 1920. And his biggest contribution to the biological world was Crow's maxim. And the idea there is that if you want to study something, then you look at it under its harshest environment because the selection pressures will be so strong that it will drive it to its optimum efficiency. So an example to kind of bring that into perspective is, say you wanted to study the water conservation of a kidney, you'd want to study that in a desert species because that is the harshest environment for water conservation. And so, and in fact, the most efficient kidney known is of the desert kangaroo rat. Interesting fact. So Toni Morrison was also a Nobel laureate of 1993, and she utilized Crow's maxim. This may not have been intentional, but I certainly noticed it. She does this in the form of the character Pekla. She is placed in the harshest literary environment. She's African American, a woman, a child, raped, physically and mentally abused. She lives in poverty and she comes from an unstable home and family. So Pekla is exposed to all of the elements and she is under the harshest environment imaginable. And so she must therefore become the most efficient to survive in that environment. And that is how I bridged the gap between Toni Morrison and a little bit of science using Crow's maxim. The other construct then is the gap between cause and effect. And the main idea that I went with there was that people think everything correlates. If there's a cause, there's an equal effect. But really, it can be a small cause that causes a huge effect. And so one of the big practices and studies right now in biology is evolutionary developmental biology. And it's formerly known as Evo-Devo, if any of you have heard that. And the big idea there is that a small genetic mutation, even a simple flipping of base pairs, will cause huge physical effects. Anything from physical deformities that are noticeable to internal genetic mutations that are completely limiting to fetal death. So it's a little offsetting that something so small can cause such a huge effect. And Morrison exercises this concept. This is in the form, again, of Pekla. And early on in the novel, Pekla loves weeds. You know, most people walk by and they use pesticides and they kill them, but Pekla loves them. There's a great quote where she says, "The dandelions at the base of the telephone pole. Why," she wonders, "do people call them weeds? She thought they were pretty." Well, that's just lovely. And it's lovely too because as a child, that's how you should be. You should be blind to race, to gender discriminations, to flowers. So, unfortunately, that is going to change. She has a conflict at a grocery store where she's trying to get a candy bar from a white cashier who is very stern with her, very impatient, and discriminates her because she's an African American child. She ends up leaving that grocery store with a completely new perspective, and she says, "Dandelions. A dart of affection leaps out from her to them, but they do not look at her and do not send love back. She thinks they are ugly. They are weeds." So Morrison definitely portrays how such a small instance can cause such a huge effect and exercises Evo-Devo. The last part that I'm going to be discussing is a personal response that I wrote to the novel The Bluest Eye, and it applies "The Map is Not the Territory." The best way that I thought to do this would be to read the introduction, discuss the middle, and read the conclusion, so bear with me. "I am pretty, I am blonde, I am white. Therefore I come from a wealthy family, get to buy nice clothes. I'm not very smart, but it's okay because I have college paid for, and I've never had to struggle a day in my life. This is how I'm mapped by other people. I would be expected to be the last person who could relate to Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. The map is not the territory. Follow the directions of a first glance, and you will never arrive at my doorstep. The territory is the truth. Welcome to the desert, a town that, although it appears on maps, is hardly a town anymore. I live in a mobile home in Topak, Arizona. This is where a family of 4, surviving off of $8,000 a year, lives in sickness and poverty. My mom, with her Indian cheekbones and frail 80-pound figure, cannot work. This reason is a combination between her kidneys and my can barely look over the counter, deaf-mute 33-year-old brother, Joe. He needs her constant care. My dad, the most wonderful man in the world, who used to stand tall like a foot, recently had a stroke. We have always been poor, but since I can remember, it has been a series of devastating events sharing the format of Morrison's novel. And I do not have college paid for. The map is not the territory. I loved The Bluest Eye, not because of the syntax, diction, or use of metaphor. I loved this novel because I saw myself in the characters and their never-ending struggle. I knew how it felt to be assigned a false life, and in some cases to want that life. I was reading familiar territory. In the novel, Peccola has an unusual relationship with 3 whores, and she finds solace in them. They are a form of medication to her and her struggle of a life. The word whore has a lot of negative connotations. Cheap, dirty, no self-worth, nowhere to go, really last resort. However, the map shifts of the word whore when Peccola defends her relationship with these whores. She says that they get her lots of stuff, buy her pretty dresses, they take her to movies. She finds solace in them. Suddenly it feels inappropriate to refer to these women as whores. One of the parts that I really enjoyed was when they were sitting together and someone makes a joke about China's legs. China's one of the whores. And she says, "Don't worry about my bandy legs. That's the first thing they push aside." Ha ha ha, everyone laughs. It's funny, but when you think about it, it's not funny. But the only way to deal is to develop that strange sense of humor, and that is what I related with. I know my family has developed the best sense of humor, and one of the great things about when you read is it takes you to a place where you remember certain things, and one of those things I remembered was a conversation with my mother on the phone, and I was like, "Oh man, Mom, I only have 13 bucks. And she goes, "Oh, don't worry, I'll go put $100 in your account." And then we laughed because 1, there's no bank in Topak. 2, she doesn't even have a license. And 3, there's no $100. To conclude is my conclusion in the personal response. The world is not flat. First impressions could be very wrong. Despite expectations, I related to this novel. I saw myself in the whores, or more appropriately, in those women. My dad always called me Joe Montana. It started when I joined my first softball team. I was the pitcher, and if I threw a ball, I could shake it off and turn right around and throw a strike. Dad was so proud. Back then, he would always chant from the stands, "Joe Montana." Reading this book reawakened that quality in me, reevaluated it, and made me realize it was normal. I was reminded of my ability to turn things around and recognize that I do so by putting a comedic perspective on the bad in life. Humor is a normal coping mechanism. It's just easier to laugh. China knew this. Who would have thought that the world was round? I am China, I am Poland, I am Topak. The map is not the territory. Thank you. Are there any questions for either of us? Pardon? No questions? Yeah?
Yep.
After reading these novels, have you read anything subsequently, and if so, has it altered the lens that you view what you read?
I've actually had to read the story of Rosa Parks for another class since reading these books, and I think it actually gave me a view that I might not have had otherwise, another context to it. The book was very straightforward and matter-of-fact about her life, and this added some emotion behind those facts. So yes.
I'm currently in the middle of John Irving's The World of Garp, if anyone's familiar with that, and there is a wonderful scene with the horrors and how they're portrayed, and I definitely analyzed that more from a respectful perspective. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Adams State College. Great stories begin here.